Most people have never read the Bible from beginning to end, and even among those who have, there are moments, verses, stories, strange interventions, where the meaning slips through the cracks of understanding. These are not the miracles everyone knows. These are not the stories we hear in children's books or Sunday morning sermons. These are the moments when heaven crossed into earth in ways that defy reason, shake foundations, and whisper of something far deeper than what appears on the page. In these rare instances, God did not speak through thunder or prophets alone. He acted, sometimes with fire, sometimes with silence, sometimes through angels, or even in the form of a stranger on the road. These interventions are not just events. They are messages woven into the narrative of history like divine footprints across time. Yet many of these moments remain misunderstood, overlooked, or dismissed as symbolic shadows. But what if they were more? What if, in these strange scenes, we could glimpse the heart of heaven itself, its justice, its mercy, its mystery? This is not just a list, it's a journey, a walk through the sacred threshold where heaven didn't merely observe history, it interrupted it. Together, we will explore 9 times heaven intervened in human history, from a flaming sword guarding paradise to armies of fire unseen by human eyes, from the silence of lions to the fire that welcomed faith, from a voice that shattered a man on the road to a veil torn by unseen hands. These are the stories you weren't told. These are the moments heaven refused to stay silent. 1. Heaven's first sword, the angels at Eden's gate. They walked, slowly, silently, eastward through the grass, their heads low, hearts heavy. Behind them, the garden faded. The place of life, of perfect communion, of untouched beauty, was now barred. Not by force, but by something deeper, by consequence. Adam and Eve had fallen, and heaven responded, not with flood, not with fire, not with thunder, but with a sword. At the entrance to Eden, heaven placed a guardian, not just any being, a cherub, whose very presence radiated divine authority. And in his hand, or perhaps around him, there swirled a flaming sword, flashing and turning in every direction, a blade that moved with intelligence, fire, and purpose. It was the first visible intervention after the fall, not to destroy, not to pursue, but to guard. Yet this act was more than protection. It was a message written in fire. The sword did not just block the way to Eden, it stood before the tree of life. If man, now corrupted, were to eat of it, he would live forever, but in brokenness. In mercy, heaven intervened. The sword said, "You shall not return this way, not yet." The cherub did not speak. He needed no words. His presence announced a new reality. Holiness and sin could no longer dwell together. But in the turning blade, there was also hope. The path was not destroyed. It was sealed, guarded, preserved for a future day when the way could be reopened, not by man's effort, but by divine redemption. Many centuries later, another sword would pierce, this time through the soul of a mother at the foot of a cross. And the veil that once guarded Eden's sacred center would be torn. But for now, the first sword burned, not in vengeance, but in sorrowful glory. It was heaven's first sentinel, standing between paradise and exile, a fiery reminder that the wages of sin were real. But so was the plan of restoration already set in motion. Adam turned back only once, and in that flash of light, he saw it, a flame that danced with judgment and promise. 2. When the heavens wept the flood of judgment. The earth no longer echoed the voice of Eden. What once teemed with life now groaned with corruption. Men multiplied, and so did their violence. Blood soaked the soil, and pride reached the skies. God looked and grieved. It is written, "The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." The heavens watched as humanity spiraled downward, exchanging innocence for cruelty, wonder for wickedness. Angels once sang over creation. Now they wept over its decay. But one man stood apart. Noah walked with God. While the world rushed toward destruction, he listened. While others mocked the unseen, he obeyed the unheard. Then heaven acted, not with whispers, but with blueprints. A strange command arrived. Build an ark. Not a boat for fishing, but a vessel the size of judgment. A structure mocked by men, but blessed by God. For 120 years, the hammer rang out, each strike a warning. Rain had never fallen. The skies were calm, but above, the heavens held something back, until the day they didn't. It began with a tremble deep within the ground. Springs burst forth, cracks split the soil. Then came the sound from above, a roar as if all of heaven had opened its grief upon the earth. Rain. Endless, unyielding. The floodgates of the deep and the windows of the sky released their fury together. Cities vanished, fields dissolved, the highest peaks became oceans. But the ark floated. Within its wooden walls, life was sealed, not just animals and a family, but a future. For 40 days and nights, judgment poured without mercy. The same water that destroyed also lifted the ark higher. The storm that wiped out sin also preserved salvation. When the rain ceased and silence returned, the earth was no longer what it had been. The first thing Noah did after leaving the ark was not build shelter, but an altar. Heaven had judged, but heaven also remembered. A rainbow stretched across the sky, not as decoration, but as a covenant. Never again. It was not the last time the heavens would weep, but it was the first time they would reshape the world to save it. A storm of sorrow had become a promise of grace. 3. The fiery rescue, angels in Sodom. Its streets were paved with indulgence, its nights thick with shadows. Laughter echoed off stone walls while justice lay bleeding in the alleys. In this city, sin wasn't hidden. It was honored. But heaven had seen enough. 2 men walked through the city gates at evening. To the human eye, they were travelers. But to heaven, they were warriors in disguise, angels wrapped in human form. They found Lot waiting. He welcomed them with urgency, urging them inside, begging them to avoid the streets after dark. They didn't come to rest. They came to rescue. Before the night could settle, a mob surrounded the house, demanding the strangers be handed over. What they wanted was unspeakable. Then the angels acted. With a touch, they pulled Lot inside and struck the crowd with blindness. Panic spread. The city that boasted clarity now stumbled in confusion. Lot still hesitated. Even as the sky began to shift, even as warning turned to countdown, he lingered. His daughters, his possessions, his life as he knew it, he couldn't let go. The angels grabbed Lot, his wife, and his daughters by the hand, not with suggestion, but forceful mercy. They dragged them from the city, guiding them beyond its borders, beyond the reach of wrath. Then came the fire. It didn't fall like rain. It erupted. Sulfur rained down like judgment made solid. The skies turned to flame. The ground trembled. Sodom was not consumed slowly. It was erased. No screams, no survivors, no ruins, only smoke rising like a funeral offering to a holy God. Behind them, Lot's wife turned. Just once. Not with her feet, but with her heart. And in that moment, she became a monument to divided loyalty, a pillar of salt frozen in time. Lot didn't look back. He didn't have to. The heat behind him was proof enough. He had escaped not because he ran, but because heaven pulled him out. This was not just judgment. It was rescue. A salvation so fierce it had to burn the road behind. Sometimes grace doesn't knock. It drags. 5. Invisible armies, The battle Elisha could see. The morning light had just begun to stretch across the hills of Dothan when the servant of Elisha stepped outside, perhaps expecting the calm of another quiet day, but instead what he saw was terror armored in iron. Surrounding the city on every side, as far as the eye could see, was an army, chariots, horses, soldiers armored for battle, eyes cold with intent, spears gleaming under the rising sun. They weren't here to lay siege, they had come for one man. Panic gripped the servant's chest as he stumbled back inside, heart pounding, voice shaking with fear. "My master!" he cried. "What shall we do?" There was no escape, no ally in sight, no reason to hope. The world had closed in. But Elisha remained calm and still, looking up from where he sat, as if this moment had long been expected. He didn't rush to the window or grab a weapon. Instead, he spoke with quiet authority, not to the servant, but through him. "Do not be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant blinked. He looked again out the window, and nothing had changed. No reinforcements, no hidden warriors, just two men trapped in a city surrounded by death. But then Elisha prayed, not for escape, not for fire from heaven, not for the enemy to vanish, but simply, "Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And with that single whispered prayer, the veil between the worlds lifted. Suddenly the servant gasped, not in fear but in awe, as the hills themselves came alive. What once seemed empty now burned with the unseen. All around them, behind and above the army of flesh and bone, were chariots of fire, thousands of them, glowing, burning, radiant with the presence of heaven. Horses that moved without dust, wheels that turned without sound, warriors that stood without fear. They had been there all along, unseen, but never absent. And in that moment, the servant understood. Human armies may surround God's people, but God's armies surround those who oppose his will. Then Elisha prayed again, but this time for the soldiers who thought they had the upper hand. "Strike them with blindness," he said. And suddenly the mighty invaders staggered like drunkards, reaching out blindly, unsure where they were or why they had come. Elisha, the one they came to capture, became their guide. He led them, blind and bewildered, not into destruction, but into mercy. That day, no sword was lifted, no blood was shed. The battle was never about force. It was about sight, what we see and what we cannot. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't what heaven sends, but what it lets us glimpse, even for a moment. 6. Lion's Den. Intervention, the silence of beasts. In a kingdom ruled by pride, papered with decrees, and fueled by the fragile egos of men in power, Daniel stood out, not because he broke the law, but because he obeyed a greater one. While others bowed to fear and custom, he bowed only to God. Morning, noon, and evening, he opened his window toward Jerusalem and prayed, openly, faithfully, without shame. And so the trap was sprung, a law crafted not for justice, but for jealousy. No petition to any god or man except the king for 30 days. And Daniel prayed anyway. The punishment was swift, as if the sentence had been waiting. There was no courtroom, no cross-examination, just a pit. A sentence not spoken in words, but in stone and steel. Rough walls closed around him like the jaws of the beasts below. Iron bars sealed shut, and beneath prowling shadows made of fur, muscle, and the endless ache of hunger. Even King Darius, who admired Daniel, who had been tricked into condemning him, found himself bound by his own law. Powerless to undo the snare he himself had signed, he could only whisper what he hoped wasn't a farewell. "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Daniel was lowered down. The stone rolled in place, the seal pressed with the king's own ring. No light, no sound, only silence. But heaven was not silent. There was no thunder, no flash of divine fire, No celestial voice booming from above, just stillness. A stillness so deep it became a presence. Something entered the pit that night, not seen, not heard, but unmistakably real. The lions paced, restless at first, growling low, eyes glowing in the dark. But slowly, something shifted. The growls faded, their muscles relaxed, their eyes dimmed, not from sleep, but from wonder. For something stronger than their instinct, stronger than their hunger, stood among them, and Daniel, faithful and fearless, lay unshaken. When morning broke, King Darius ran, not walked, to the den. His voice cracked with a mixture of fear and desperate hope as he called out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you?" For a breathless moment, there was nothing. Then, from within the depths of the earth, came a calm and unwavering reply. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me, for I was found innocent in his sight." When Daniel was lifted out, not a single scratch marked his body. The lions hadn't forgotten how to kill. Nature hadn't changed, but heaven had overruled it. The laws of men had condemned him. The instincts of beasts had threatened him. But the law of God had covered him with a shield not made of stone or steel, but of presence. The lions' mouths were not closed by force, but by awe at the one even they could not defy. Because sometimes heaven doesn't make a scene. It doesn't roar to prove its strength. It whispers, and even beasts must listen. 7. The fiery furnace, God in the flames. When the music played, the world bowed, but 3 men stood, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, captives of an empire, but free in spirit. Their king had built a golden idol, towering, shining, and deadly. The command was clear, worship or burn. They refused, not with anger, not with protest, but with unshakable calm. Our God is able to deliver us, but even if he does not, we will not bow. The furnace was stoked, 7 times hotter than normal. The flames roared like wild beasts, hungry to consume defiance. Even the soldiers who brought them to the furnace were killed by the heat. Bound hand and foot, they were thrown in. And then, something changed. The king leaned forward to look into the blaze, and suddenly stood in shock. "Did we not cast 3 men into the fire?" They nodded. "Yes, 3. But I see 4, walking freely, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." The fire had not touched their bodies. Not a single hair was singed. Not even the smell of smoke clung to them. But it had done something else entirely. It had burned away their chains. Inside the inferno, they were not alone. God didn't put out the fire. He stepped into it. He did not save them from the flames, but in them. When they came out, the crowd saw only 3, but the memory of the 4th burned brighter than the fire itself. This was not a vision, not a symbol. It was real. Heaven stepped into the fire, not to display power, but to reward loyalty. Because sometimes the presence of God isn't found in palaces or temples. Sometimes it stands beside the faithful, in the middle of the flames. 8. The veil torn. Heaven reacts to the crucifixion. A bruised and bleeding man hung between heaven and earth, arms outstretched, body pierced, breath fading slowly. Around him stood a crowd numb to cruelty, soldiers casting lots, onlookers staring in curiosity, and leaders content that their threat had been silenced. But heaven did not stay silent. At the very moment Jesus breathed his last, the earth shuddered in anguish, rocks split apart with no human hand touching them. The sky, dark since noon, seemed to fold inward, as if creation itself were grieving. Tombs opened, the ground gave way. For the first time in history, death looked afraid, and then, within the temple, far from the hill of execution, something unimaginable occurred. The great veil, thick as a man's hand and made to endure generations, was torn from top to bottom. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't by man. It was heaven's doing. It was as if the unseen hands of God reached down and split the barrier that had stood between himself and humanity for generations. This veil, once a sign of separation, of sacred distance, was now an open wound in the heart of religion. What once barred man from God's presence was now ripped open because the one on the cross had opened a new and living way. It was not just cloth that was torn. It was the old system, the priesthood, the blood sacrifices, the stone altars, all of it undone in a moment, replaced by a single sacrifice so perfect that it echoed through heaven and earth alike. The world saw a man die. Heaven heard a victory roar, the trembling of the ground, the breaking of the rocks, the rising of the dead from their graves. These were not signs of chaos, but signals that something eternal had shifted. Heaven didn't turn away, it drew closer, and when the Son cried out and gave up his spirit, all of heaven answered, not with trumpets or angels, but with a silence that split stone, a veil torn in two, and a holy place flung open forever. What no priest could ever do, the Son accomplished. And from that moment on, God would not dwell behind a curtain, but within the hearts of men. The wrestling stranger, Jacob and the divine duel. The camp had gone quiet, the fires reduced to embers, and the river Jabbok shimmered faintly under the weight of night. Everyone had crossed, his wives, his sons, his servants, his possessions, all sent ahead like pieces on a chessboard, moved in desperate preparation. But Jacob remained, alone. Not just on the banks of the river, but in the silence of himself, caught between everything he had been and everything he feared to become. His brother Esau was approaching with 400 men, and though Jacob had grown wealthy and clever, there were no gifts large enough, no words smooth enough to erase the betrayal of years past. The one who had stolen blessings now trembled under the possibility of justice, and so he stayed behind, not just to pray, but to wrestle with a weight far heavier than fear. And then, without sound, without warning, a man appeared. He offered no greeting, no explanation, no sword, only resistance. A force that collided with Jacob in the dark and locked him in combat. No words were exchanged, no questions asked, only the raw strain of flesh against flesh, spirit against presence. They wrestled through the dust, through the hours, through the dark that would not lift. Jacob, who had spent his life grasping first the heel of his brother, then his birthright, then his uncle's flocks, now held on to something far beyond his understanding. This was no ordinary man. The strength was otherworldly, the silence sacred. But Jacob would not let go. Even as his hip was touched and dislocated with a single gesture, his body broken in a flash, he clung tighter, not with pride but with desperation. The kind that comes when one realizes they are no longer wrestling for dominance, but for identity. Let me go, for the day breaks. I will not let you go unless you bless me. It was not a demand. It was confession. A cry from the deepest part of a man who had schemed for blessings all his life, and now begged for one that could not be stolen. "What is your name?" "Jacob," he whispered, his voice not just naming himself, but naming everything broken within him. And the response did not rebuke, it redefined. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled with God and with men, and have prevailed." And as the figure vanished with the dawn, Jacob was left standing in the same place, but not the same man. Limping, yes, but changed. Not because he had overpowered heaven, but because he had held on until heaven changed him. He named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. And from that day on, Jacob walked differently, not just in body, but in being. Because sometimes heaven doesn't fight you to defeat you, it fights you to rename you.